Hello, everyone. My name is Julia Gross, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Hamburg, where I study how finance can support the development of the circular economy and circular business models. A few years into my research, I began to suspect that finance as usual and even approaches such as ESG or impact investing were not designed to support the systemic transformation required to shift from a linear to a circular economy. At the time, I didn't know what the missing ingredient was, so I started exploring alternative ways of thinking about complex systems and finance. And that's when I came across ergodicity economics and the farmer's fable. This sparked my curiosity about how pooling and collaboration might be applied to circular economies, and especially the way they are financed. So a research paper on this topic was born, and today I'll share a brief overview. The work is co-authored with my PhD supervisor, Professor Fenna Blomsma, Chair of Circular Economy and Systems Innovation at the University of Hamburg. It also builds on the work of Dr. Graham Boyd, founder and CEO of Evolutesix, who applies ergodicity economics to entrepreneurship and investing. So together, the three of us began exploring a simple question. If circular ecosystems operate in a fundamentally non-ergodic world, what does finance need to look like to support them? So I'll start with a visual diagram showing two very different worlds. The linear economy with finance as usual on the left-hand side, and the circular economy with circular finance on the right-hand side. So let's first focus on the left-hand side, where we see the linear economy with finance as usual. Production is organized through linear supply chains, driving ever-increasing resource throughput and waste. At the same time, value flows upward into the financial layer, where financial capital extracts and concentrates surplus value from the system. At the core of this dynamic are two mechanisms that lock in linearity. The first is a dysfunctional response to non-ergodic dynamics. Because financial strategies rely on ensemble average return expectations, firms are pushed towards performance targets that are unrealistic for any single firm over time. To compensate, they are driven to increase resource extraction and throughput, illustrated here as the 5 times extraction dynamic. The second is shareholder primacy governance, where voting rights, control, and profit claims are concentrated in financial shareholders, enabling rent extraction and value concentration in the financial layer. Together, these mechanisms reinforce a dynamic of linear resource extraction and linear financial extraction. On the right-hand side, we see something quite different. If we think of circular economies as collaborative ecosystems of firms and stakeholders working together to circulate resources over multiple cycles, the picture then changes. Much of the circular economy literature focuses on material circularity, while finance is often treated as a neutral background condition. But ignoring the linear selection pressures of the financial system runs a high risk of failure, because linear financial mechanisms will continually push circular economies back toward linear dynamics. And so the argument here is simple. If we want circulation in the material layer, then the financial layer also needs to become circular. So we can think of circular economies as resembling natural ecosystems, networks of interconnected actors exchanging resources. Insights from network science explain what healthy ecosystems look like in terms of network structure. Long-term ecosystem health depends on the balance between efficiency and resilience. When networks have low diversity and low connectivity, they become highly efficient and streamlined. Resources move quickly through a small number of optimized pathways, but this also removes network redundancy, making the system fragile to shocks. By contrast, networks with higher diversity and connectivity contain many alternative pathways and fallback positions. This makes them much more resilient, but also less efficient because resources move through a more complex network. So these two attributes pull in opposite directions. Too much efficiency creates brittle systems, while too much redundancy leads to stagnation. The optimal balance lies somewhere between these extremes. Sally Gerner and her colleagues describe this as the window of viability, the range where ecosystems can circulate resources efficiently while still remaining resilient and adaptive. However, when we apply this framework to economic and financial systems, something very important is missing. It does not explicitly account for non-ergodic dynamics, which is what I introduced in the next step. So we extended the two-dimensional window of viability framework by adding a third dimension, the degree of non-ergodicity, ranging from 0 to infinity. The key idea is that the window of viability is not fixed. Rather, the optimal balance between efficiency and resilience changes depending on how non-ergodic the environment is. At the front of the diagram, the purple curve A represents a world with 0 non-ergodicity, a perfectly predictable system with additive dynamics. In that case, the optimal configuration is maximum efficiency and no redundancy. But as soon as dynamics become multiplicative, volatile, and unpredictable, in other words, as they become increasingly non-ergodic, systems require correspondingly higher levels of diversity, connectivity, and redundancy in order to remain viable. So the window of viability shifts progressively to the right as non-ergodicity increases. And the key insight is that in today's highly non-ergodic world, viable systems would need to operate somewhere around curve D, but the current financial system still operates around curve B, with its emphasis on maximum efficiency and strategies that would only be optimal in a world of 0 to low non-ergodicity. So what this diagram highlights is a systems change gap between curve B, where finance as usual operates, and curve D, where viable circular ecosystems actually need to function. This suggests that incremental tweaks to finance as usual are not enough. The financial system itself requires a paradigm shift, and the question then becomes, what kind of financial architecture would support circular ecosystems operating around curve D? And just as a quick side note, there is some mathematics underpinning the 3D diagram. In the appendix of our paper, we outline a set of cornerstone equations that define the degree of non-ergodicity and the corresponding optimal balance between efficiency and redundancy. Further refinement of the maths is an important area for future research. So how do we operate around curve D and overcome the two linear selection pressures I mentioned at the beginning of the talk? Our proposal is what we call the phi strategy, which consists of two circular mechanisms designed to support circular financial and resource flows. The first is an intra-ecosystem financial pooling mechanism. At regular intervals, each company contributes a previously agreed fraction of its profits or capital gains into a shared pool, which is then immediately redistributed across all ecosystem members. This creates a deliberately collaborative strategy for correcting the non-ergodic dynamics inherent in complex systems. The second mechanism is a shift in corporate governance. We believe that the pooling mechanism must be supported by institutions capable of sustaining trust, coordination, and fair value distribution. This could be achieved through polycentric, multi-stakeholder governance structures that distribute decision-making and wealth-sharing rights across the actors who sustain the ecosystem, rather than concentrating them solely in financial shareholders. Together, these two mechanisms provide the institutional foundation needed to keep circular ecosystems operating within their window of viability. To explore this idea further, we ran some preliminary simulations, which modeled an investment fund made up of businesses exposed to non-ergodic volatility over a 10-year period. We varied two things: the number of firms in the fund, representing ecosystem size, and the degree of profit pooling between those firms, representing ecosystem connectivity. So the blue lines show what happens with zero pooling. And what we see is that increasing the fund diversity alone has a minimal effect, meaning that even as the number of firms increases, the probability of achieving a 3 times return for investors improves only slightly, and the firm's survival rate remains relatively low. But once profit pooling is introduced with 50 and 100% pooling, shown by the red and yellow lines, both the likelihood of a 3 times return and firm survival rates increase significantly as the ecosystem grows. Pooling therefore improves both the underlying ecosystem viability as well as investor returns. And by the way, if you're curious and would like to try out the simulator yourself for free, you can find it at planner.evolutesix.com. This is an early alpha release, and we welcome any feedback and suggestions for improvement. So to wrap up, circular ecosystems operate in a highly non-ergodic economy. Yet today they are financed using strategies that fail to account for the degree of non-ergodicity. That mismatch pushes circular ecosystems toward curve B, where they remain fragile and less viable over time. To reach curve D, finance itself needs to become circular. The PHI strategy shows one way this could be achieved by investing in large, diverse ecosystems of interconnected profit pooling firms supported by multi-stakeholder governance. Financial systems can be designed to keep circular ecosystems within their window of viability. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to the panel discussion.